January 1985, the 40th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz, most notorious of all the Nazi concentration camps. Here, 4.5 million people were murdered in pursuit of an ideology that called on scientists to create a super race. Auschwitz was more than an extermination center. It was a human laboratory where science lost all touch with reality and where some of the most horrific experiments ever known to man were carried out by a team of 24 doctors. The most infamous of these was Dr. Joseph Mengele.
Mengele came to Auschwitz at the end of April 43. Just a month before that, a train had arrived from Bialystok. And this train was full of gypsies dying with typhoid. And in fact, one has to understand that this train, full of dying gypsies, all of them being sick with a sickness which could spread to all the camp, was a real problem. And so they decided to do what one does in such cases in an animal quarter. That is to separate the sick from the non-sick and to kill all of them, which in fact Mengele was involved with. This was the decisive point. After one made the first final wrong decision, all is said, and there is no way out of it.
One has to remember, I think, that the Nazi murder of Jews, which was something very specific and very separate, we call it the Holocaust, and the mass murder of others, which was not part of the Holocaust, which was a reorganization, if you will, a racial reorganization of Europe. Absolutely crazy, but it was in line with their ideology. This was made possible by the fact that the Nazi elite, the true believers one might call them, managed to persuade and bring onto their side the mass of German intellectuals, of whom Mengele was one.
Joseph Mengele was born on the 16th of March 1911 in the small Bavarian town of Günzburg. He was the third son of Karl Mengele, the wealthiest burgher of the town, whose agricultural machinery firm, Karl Mengele and Son, was Günzburg's principal employer, and still is. Joseph seemed destined for a career in the family business, but his interests were in science. He went to the local primary and grammar schools and was brought up a strict Roman Catholic.
The Mengele family is well known for their arch-conservative and very Christian attitude. Right from the beginning, they did not want to support Hitler. The father was regarded as a conservative, the Bavarian People's Party, the equivalent of today's CSU, the Christian Socialist Union. Only after 1933, and probably for business reasons, did Mengele's father join the party, the National Socialists.
Between 1930 and 1932, Mengele studied medicine and natural sciences at the universities of Munich and Bonn. A close friend and fellow student remembers the young Mengele.
He was never one to use his wealth to impress others, nor was he ever aloof. He always regarded himself as an equal and was always ready for a practical joke, as students often do to make each other laugh, particularly when they have other worries. He did not distinguish himself from other students, except that he was essentially more industrious, hard-working and ambitious. The more he became involved in the study of anthropology, genetics, heredity and such things, the more his interest grew.
He got a PhD in Munich, he got an MD in Frankfurt, and he did some scientific work, he published this, and he was just exactly what one normally calls a young scientist, who presumably is going to make his career out of science. His teachers were, from the point of view of science, pretty good. They were both anti-Semites, and he didn't learn anything reasonable in this respect from his teachers.
On New Year's Day, 1937, Mengele started work as a research assistant in the Institute for Heredity, Genetics and Racial Hygiene in Frankfurt, where he worked under the eminent geneticist Professor Freiherr Ottmar von Verschuur. It was to prove a major turning point in Mengele's career.
In science, he was a famous man in whole Europe for twins research. Mengele and Verschuur had a good contact, I think so. And Verschuur needed an anthropologist at this institute. It was at this time to be an honor or to come to this institute. We had only 2 institutes in Germany about this matter, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin and the Institute in Frankfurt. It was like the Dalton Laboratory in London.
While Mengele began his research work, Hitler's Nazi regime had adopted an extreme form of Darwin's theory of the survival of the fittest. Nazi propaganda now dictated that the mentally ill polluted the German race, and that most of the mentally ill were Jewish.
The general idea was those mutants which were, and now they began judging, inferior, were propagating faster than the others. And strangely enough, almost all human geneticists thought that if nothing happened, just this process would lead to the end of Western civilization. This was a general idea among American, English, German, and French and Swedish geneticists. So the question is what to do.
The Nazis tried forcibly to sterilize Germany's 400,000 mentally ill, but by 1939, Hitler had decided on a program of liquidation, which was speedily carried out. At the same time, the Nuremberg laws deprived German Jews of all their civil rights. Having gained his doctorate in anthropology at Munich University in 1935, Mengele graduated as a doctor of medicine at Frankfurt in 1938. He was then sent, by the Institute for Racial Hygiene, to Posen to investigate the racial purity of couples wanting to get married. But his real desire now was to fight for the fatherland, like his colleague, Dr. Grieb, who'd already won an Iron Cross. By the beginning of 1939, he was a full member of the SS, and on July 28th that year, married Irene Schönbein, a university professor's daughter, whose family background had to be vetted for Aryan purity by the SS. Mengele volunteered and was accepted into Hitler's private army, the Waffen-SS, and found himself on the Russian front as a field doctor. fighting on the Russian front was particularly bloody, and Mengele, only recently qualified as a doctor, was suddenly confronted with the horrendous consequences of war.
His medical time was, of course, a short one. When you know, a medical doctor has to grow up in medicine for years, for a long time of experience. And the older doctor is every time a better one because he has more experience than the one. And he had no experience in medicine. And so I can understand that the ethical side in his personality had no chance to survive.
War rapidly eroded what remained of the Nazis' moral restraints. Dachau concentration camp, built in 1933 to house political opponents and Jews, became in 1941 the site for the first human experiments. Here was an unlimited supply of human research material. At first, the Germans had used their own servicemen for military experiments, as in these high-altitude tests for gunners. In these tests, scientific ethics prevailed. But with the inmates of the concentration camps, no such rules applied. This Jewish prisoner met a slow death in a low-pressure chamber. His skull was opened, and his brain was taken out for examination.
Hitler was the father who took responsibility for everything. So any kind of a moral obstacle to whatever had to be done disappeared, because it was the father who said that it should be so. In fact, the Nazi philosophers were using Christian images taken out of the New Testament. The father of the people, the spirit of the race, the son of the folk. These were distorted and perverted Christian images that were used, and upon this father figure all the responsibility was thrown. So there was no personal moral responsibility any longer.
In 1942, Mengele was injured on the Russian front and returned to his old mentor, Professor Verschuer, who was by now director of Germany's most prestigious scientific establishment, the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute in Berlin.
Professor Verschuer, who was the director of this institute, in fact filed an application for research money before Mengele went to Auschwitz for exactly what Mengele did in Auschwitz. That is, one may conclude from that in fact the student, that is Mengele, talked it over with his professor whether he should go to Auschwitz. And I would almost bet that the idea was, after all, that's a big opportunity for science, many races there, many people, why don't you go there? That's a good idea for science. And so that actually Mengele got talked into by his professor to go to Auschwitz.
By 1943, Hitler's final solution was nearing its goal. Trainloads of Jews were being shipped to the east, to what they were told was the promised land.
After 3 days being in the cattle wagon, with 1 bucket of water and 1 bucket as a WC, 70 people perhaps perched in, the train came to a stand, and I thought I'm in an inferno, because there were screams, out, 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 leave everything behind, alles liegen lassen, heraus, heraus, and dogs were barking, SS was there, and we didn't know what to do. We sprang down from the wagon, one after the other. The elderly people couldn't move and couldn't, it was terrible. And in between this SS with the barking dogs, there were people going in striped uniforms like pajamas. And I asked one of them, tell me, where are we? And he told me, Auschwitz.
The moment they brought the transport from the ramp, with 1,200 or 1,500 people, the command was given for them to strip. Each person had to put his clothes in a separate pile so that they did not get mixed up, and amidst shouting and screaming, they shoved them into the gas chambers. We felt great pain, and were really in two minds whether to tell or not to tell. Can you imagine telling a person that these are the last moments of his life and that he is being taken to his death? How can you tell someone this? It's quite a different thing to hear this story than to see it with one's own eyes, to see how they led a mother with 5 or 6 children straight to the gas chambers, and after a few minutes to see them as one jumbled mass. They were completely stuck together. They'd probably had an excruciating death by suffocation, the worst thing that could happen. There was one incident involving the son of the rabbi's aunts. I approached him by chance. He was standing right next to the door of the gas chambers, and at that moment the SS officer started to push people inside, shouting, "Quickly, quickly, quickly!" And he gave me his hand by the door and said to me, "You will remain alive." And I said to him, "Rabbi, now it's you, but tomorrow it will be me." And he said to me, "No, you will stay alive, and you will tell the whole world what these wicked people have done to us."
Joshua Rosenblum is one of only 12 survivors of the Sonderkommando, the Commando of the Living Dead. For 3 months, these squads of Jews were forced to cremate the dead at Auschwitz before they themselves were exterminated. The final solution demanded no witnesses. It was to this environment that the 32-year-old Mengele came in 1943. Here, he was to find all the human material he needed for his perverted program of research. Auschwitz-Birkenau was a collection of 12 camps, housing over 250,000 prisoners. In March 1943, Himmler decreed that only doctors trained in anthropology could carry out selections. Mengele, the anthropologist, was initially assigned to Birkenau, where he selected those fit for work. The rest were exterminated. He went about his work with efficiency and dedication, with a grant which Professor Verschuur had obtained from the German Research Association.
Mengele ordered to all the selection staff of SS what they should do, that how many people should come directly to the gas chamber, how many people will be selected for the slave work. And they were exhausted, they were also killed or were sent to the gas chamber. And for experiment. The experiment, this was the main interest of Mengele. He ordered the doctors to select twins. He was obsessed by it, to have his right objects for experiments. So he didn't trust to the selection staff, so he stand there, he observed and inspected.
From the hundreds of thousands of prisoners at Auschwitz, Mengele could collect twins in quantities never before available to a scientist. His mentor, Professor Verschuur, had written of the absolute necessity of research on twins as a means of achieving complete and reliable determination of exactly what is heredity. From this, the National Socialists hoped to produce the perfect Aryan man.
He came in every single morning after roll call. He looked like a very handsome, good-looking man with his polished boots, with his stick always hitting the boots. And my impression of him was at the beginning that he was a terrifying person. It wasn't because his face looked terrifying. His face looked very pleasant, but the atmosphere in the barrack before he came and all the preparation by the supervisors was creating that atmosphere of terror and horror that Mengele, here comes Mengele was coming. So everybody had to stand still, and he would notice that one of the bunk beds, the twin, was dead. I was very much puzzled that he would yell and scream and carry on. What happened? How is that possible that this twin died? But of course I understand it today. It was not part of the experiment, therefore they spoiled his experiment.
He chose me after a while to be his personal messenger, errand boy, what they call loafer, and also to attend to his quarters as far as cleaning and making sure the stove had coal and the stove was cleaned, and his boots, and also to bring sometimes his meals. His living quarter in my camp was very basic, except it was designed differently, and he had a garden around it, and he had an entranceway that was more conducive as a study room, as a restroom, as a lab type of room.
Mengele is accused of being involved in the deaths of 400,000 Auschwitz prisoners. But his notoriety comes from the experiments he carried out on victims subjected to injections, electrocution, radiation, and horrific surgery. In specially designated blocks, Mengele and his team of doctors carried out their experiments.
We went into the area next to the washroom, where Mengele carried out his operations. And there we saw 3 children. The skulls had their tops removed, and they were empty.
וכאן זה הכל מה שהיה בפנים, זה היה ריק. זה, הוא הסתכל על זה, אז
Kuva said to me, "Take a good look.
תסתכל טוב עליהם. לפני יום אני ראיתי
Only
אותם.
yesterday I saw them alive."
הוא הביא אותם, הם לא ידעו למה שהם הולכים.
Mengele brought them, and they didn't know where they were going. Dr. Mengele, with his soft-spoken voice, always spoke gently to those that he was about to experiment upon. Kuva said to me, "These aren't the only ones. They always throw me such corpses to deal with."
Mengele came every day, brought chocolate for them, the most beautiful clothes, white pantaloons, white even aprons, and the girls had ribbons in the hair. One day he shouted on me, he told, because one ribbon was lower than the other one, told me, "How do you do it? They are not like I like them." Then one day came a assessment and they took the children away. They were my pets, Tito and Nino. One of them was a hunchback. I don't remember exactly, 2 or 3 days after, another assessment brought them back in a terrible state. They were cutted. The boy or the girl, the hunchback, was sewn to the other one, back to back. The wrist, back to back. It was a terrible smell also, already, gangrene. The cuttings were dirty, and the children did cry day and night.
When you make experiments on mice or apes or rats, people who do that can do it because they do not identify with the objects of their experiment. Now, of course, if you make experiments on white rats, you know, white rats can sometimes be quite nice. So some of these doctors establish a relationship of, well, you know, this is a nice animal, I have to kill it, but, you know, while it's still alive, we have some kind of a relation. That is the kind of relationship that is established between these murderers and their victims.
In the morning came Mengele after my birth, after I gave birth. And he gave the order to bandage my breasts because he wanted to know how long a baby can live without food. And my breasts were bandaged. And he came every day to visit me. The very first days the baby was crying, and then he was only whimpering, and then he had no strength anymore. Until one day, it was I think the 7th day, when Mengele arrived, he told me, "Tomorrow be ready with your child, I'm coming to take you and your child." I started terribly to cry, because I've known these are my last days and I'm going tomorrow to be guest. And there, when I was crying so much, there came Maca. Maca byla lékařkou.
Matza was a doctor in Auschwitz, and she came to me. I was crying, and she was asking me, "How can I help you?"
We knew that the next day in the morning, Mengele would come and would take you away. We knew what that meant. So I said to myself, I will help you. So I got a syringe. And one prisoner, he was Polish. He was always coming over to our camp. He was supposed to do something with the electricity or the plumbing. So I said to him, get some morphine and strychnine. I needed to save a young life. So I came to you with a syringe, and I told you to inject it. I couldn't do it because of my oath.
Hippocrates.
My Hippocratic oath. So we injected it, and it was all over. Then Mengele came, and he was looking for the baby. So you told him that it was no longer alive.
I didn't want to live after having done this terrible thing. I killed my own child. And I didn't want to live. And he asked, where's your child? I told, this night it died. And he ran outside and was looking for this little body. But every morning bodies were collected. And they were heaped in front of our barracks. And in this heap of bodies, he couldn't find this little body. So he came back and told me in such a German idiom, he told me, you had luck. With the next transport, you're leaving Auschwitz.
He told Mrs. Verschwür, the wife of his professor, that it was absolutely horrible in Auschwitz, that he wanted to get out of there. And one may think the fact that he got so many people involved in his research may have been kind of a revenge of the person who got misled by his professors, who never dared to think about reality, to get all this blood over them, which of course they after the war denied vehemently.
On January 27, 1945, the Red Army liberated Auschwitz. 4.5 million people had perished here. The warrant for Mengele's arrest charges that he was personally responsible for the shooting of over 100 children in the back of the head, that he dissected a 1-year-old child while still alive, that he took a newly born baby from its mother and threw it into a pit of fire, that he stood on pregnant women's stomachs until the fetuses were expelled, that he personally administered deadly injections into the hearts of 14 sets of twins to provide him with fresh corpses for his research. 10 days before the Red Army arrived, Mengele and the other doctors fled.
The last time I saw Dr. Joseph Mengele was Christmas Eve. The time had to be around 8, 9 in the evening or night. I was in the washroom, and evidently he must have found that I was there because he came with 2 other assessment orderly, and one came into the washroom and, in a sense, called me out. And when they all stood together, I saw that he was wearing his boots, his stiefel, and he was wearing his leather coat, but he was still wearing his soft hat. His face was reddish, his eyes were sort of like tired, almost my sense as if he was sad. Tears could have come out, and he put his hand on my head and he said, adieu. And while he turned, he said, "You were a good boy."
At the end of the war, Mengele was interned by the Americans along with many other German soldiers. But unlike other SS officers, he'd avoided having the telltale SS tattoo of his blood group under his left arm. And further, he'd disguised himself in an old Wehrmacht uniform. With this, he managed to merge with other Wehrmacht troops and ran into an old colleague he'd known before the war.
Von ihm habe ich wohl zum ersten Mal gehört, dass
It was from him that I first heard that he did selections from the ramp.
und da erinnere ich mich, dass
And I remember him saying that old people never had a chance of surviving in the camp,
gehabt, in dem Lager zu überleben, und die hätte
and that he automatically sent them to the gas chamber.
in die Vergasung geschickt. Hat einmal
He once came out with a very definite quotation from the Bible.
Satz ausgesprochen, sprach das Bibelwort aus, was nützet.
For what hath the man profited if he shall gain the world and lose his own soul?
Das konnte ich nur darauf.
I could only assume that he was referring to himself and the whole Hitler regime.
After spending 6 weeks in the first camp, supposedly under the false name of Memmeling, Mengele fled with a convoy of Red Cross trucks to northern Bavaria, where he was interned by the Americans for a second time.
In dem zweiten Lager, wo wir dann
In the second camp, from where we were later released, he was released under the name Mengele.
das ist also, habe ich ganz
I very clearly witnessed this. He was unsure whether he was on the lists, but he was definitely released under the name Mengele.
Mengele had slipped through the Allied net and changed his name to Fritz Hollmann. His real name, however, had frequently cropped up as early as April 1945 on secret American documents relating to the atrocities in Auschwitz. In September 1945, 2 American military policemen interrogated Irene, Mengele's wife, but she denied all knowledge of his whereabouts. In fact, he was working on a farm south of Rosenheim in Upper Bavaria. Mengele still hoped to continue his scientific career, but realized that he couldn't do that in Europe. For Irene, life was impossible, and she asked for a divorce and kept their son Rolf. But to escape from Europe, Mengele needed money.
The family of Joseph Mengele was glad to pay because they wanted to get rid of him in order not to endanger the business. You know, it was still the period of the denazification, and a lot of the possessions and the money of old Nazis could be taken by the authorities. And so the family was very glad that this looked-for war criminal Joseph Mengele would finally leave Germany and go in a country as far as possible.
At the end of 1948, Mengele made his way southwards over the Alps and into the Italian Tyrol. From the Red Cross offices in Geneva, he obtained a Nansen passport under the name of Helmut Gregor. Ironically, these documents were issued to help repatriate victims of the Nazis. Here in the Red Cross offices is Mengele's file.
There arose problems because they had disappeared several hundreds of these Nansen passports. And so all these Nansen passports have been controlled very thoroughly in this period. There should not have been problems for him because an Italian employee at the Customs and Passport Office at Genoa was part of the chain of the line, escape line, that was used by Mengele. But unfortunately, this man in the office at Genoa was just on holidays. So he came to a quite normal police officer who arrested, for the moment, all bearers of a Nansen passport of the International Red Cross. So also Mengele was arrested. And his real identity nearly had been discovered then, but fortunately for Joseph Mengele, this employee came back from holidays and he sorted out all the problems, and then Mengele was able to go on board the ship that brought him to Buenos Aires.
On June the 22nd, 1949, Mengele passed through the Genoa customs and emigration alone to board a French merchant ship, the North King, bound for South America. Although it was well known to the German police that Mengele had used false Red Cross documents to escape from Europe, no one asked to see his file in Geneva until 1985. On September the 17th, 1949, the North King tied up in the port of Buenos Aires in Argentina. His family had financed Mengele's escape from Europe on condition that he relinquish his 1/3 share in the family business. Mengele had chosen Argentina because the then president, Juan Perón, had cemented firm links with Hitler's Germany during the war and wished to model Argentina on National Socialist ideals. Argentina was a country where Nazis were not only welcome, they were also respected. Mengele had brought with him considerable family funds which enabled him to live in the affluent Buenos Aires suburb of Florida. He mixed with the rich, owned his own car, and started a carpentry business making furniture and children's toys. Mengele had also brought with him slides of the blood of his Auschwitz victims, with which he hoped to continue his research and achieve his ambition of being a leading geneticist. He renewed his contact with a colleague from the war, Dr. Alfredo Timmerman, who ran a small pharmaceutical business here at 1551 Calle Asuénaga in the center of Buenos Aires. Timmerman invited Mengele to become a partner in the Fadra Farm laboratory. He soon became an active member of the company in charge of research and publicity. He also renewed his acquaintance with another old friend, by now the company's secretary.
I called him Dr. Gregor because that was how he had been introduced. And then he corrected me, telling me that it was Dr. Mengele and not Dr. Gregor. I was rather surprised by this, but he explained to me that he had got the name of Dr. Gregor when he left Germany after the war because of political problems. He was very nice. He was always very happy and always telling jokes. He liked to whistle. Classical tunes mainly. I can't remember exactly which composers now, but a little Mozart, I think.
By 1956, Mengele was living quite openly in Buenos Aires, having obtained an Argentine identity card, as well as a new passport from the German embassy in his own name. So secure did he feel that he was confident enough to travel to Europe. He flew to Zurich, where he met his son Rolf, who in those days knew him as Uncle Fritz.
I came there to a winter holiday. I didn't knew that this is my father. My family told me we are meeting Uncle Fritz. He's coming from South America. And I didn't realize that it was my father. I remember Uncle Fritz, my father, was a very interesting man because he was talking about the war. Other adults never spoke about the war. And of course, for a young boy, it was very, very interesting. He was very sympathetic and he tried to give us anything we wanted, and I liked him as an uncle.
Also on that skiing holiday was Martha, the widow of Mengele's brother Karl, together with her son Karl-Heinz. The following year, Martha and her son Karl-Heinz joined Mengele in Buenos Aires. They decided to get married. For the family in Günzburg, the marriage solved two problems. Both Martha and Joseph were cared for, whilst Mengele himself re-established a firm link with the homeland. They settled in a pleasant house in the well-to-do district of Vicente Lopez, with the help of money from the family business. Despite constant denials that the Mengele company in Günzburg was funding Joseph Mengele, the deeds of his house in Vicente Lopez were in fact in the name of Carl Mengele and Son, and the person who came to Argentina on the company's behalf was Mengele's old school friend and the company solicitor, Hans Sedlmayr. Sedlmayr was henceforth to be the vital financial link between Mengele and the family in Germany. Mengele wasn't the only Nazi enjoying freedom in Buenos Aires. On the other side of town, living in poverty, was Adolf Eichmann, the man responsible for the transport of millions of Jews to their deaths in the concentration camps. In a carefully planned and daring kidnap, Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, snatched Eichmann from the street next to his home and smuggled him back to Israel, where he was tried and later hanged. The kidnapping caused an international outcry, but the original plan in 1960 was far more ambitious.
And it was decided quite to make kind of a commando raid, and the last moment to kill two flies at the same time and to capture Mengele and take him with us with the same plane. I didn't like the idea because I thought it is too dangerous, but luckily Mengele wasn't there anymore. We now know that he had left Argentine when the German prosecutor had asked for his extradition in 1959.
So, 14 years after the war had ended, the West German authorities finally issued a warrant for Joseph Mengele's arrest. This, along with Mossad's actions, made it impossible for Mengele to live openly in Buenos Aires. He fled Argentina.
He seemed very quiet that day. He was very sad, very worried. He gave me a lot of advice about the company, about what we should do, and how the remaining partners should always get on well together. I said that I would see him again. I didn't want any definite farewell. Then he told me with great certainty, "Elsa, we will never meet again." I remember that shocked me. I felt that we had spent so much time together, and now to just... But I didn't ask him anything else then, because I knew that he didn't want me to. So we kissed each other, and I got out of the car and waved goodbye to him. That was the last time that we were together, and I have never had any news of him since.
The fugitive Mengele slipped across the Argentine border into Paraguay in April 1960, conveniently just 2 months before the warrant for his arrest was issued in Buenos Aires. President Stroessner of Paraguay, himself of Bavarian descent, sheltered many Nazis who fled Germany after the Second World War. Stroessner admired many wartime Nazi commanders, amongst them the ace Luftwaffe pilot Hans Ulrich Rudel. Rudel was the key figure in introducing Mengele to Wolfgang Gerhardt, an Austrian who lived in Brazil. Gerhardt was a fervent Nazi who was able to use his contacts to hide Mengele for 6 months in a tiny 3-by-4-meter room and finally, in October 1960, smuggle him across the border into Brazil and to the crowded anonymity of multiracial Sao Paulo, the largest city in the southern hemisphere. It was a clever maneuver. For the next 20 years, the world was convinced that Joseph Mengele was living under Stroessner's protection in Paraguay. For Martha, like Irene before her, life with a fugitive was unbearable. In late 1960, she left for Germany, leaving Mengele once more alone.
Wolfgang Gerhardt used his personal contacts in the German emigration in Sao Paulo to look for somebody who would be a reliable person and would be manipulable. And he found the Stammers. Gerhardt offered them a Swiss administrator for his little farm, not saying that it was Mengele. He said, this is a Swiss citizen who inherited something. He comes with money and he can be your partner.
The Stammers were right-wing Hungarians who had emigrated to Brazil after the revolution of 1956. Gita had to manage their small farm alone since her husband, Geza, a surveyor, spent long periods away from home. Mengele became their farm manager. By now he was calling himself Peter Hochbichler.
When he arrived, I was already working here. He was introduced to us as the manager. We took care of the cattle. We even operated on a calf which had a big hernia. Mr. Peter operated and I watched. He did the job properly. He shaved where he was going to cut, then he cut it, sewed it up and disinfected it. Then he treated it every day. The calf recovered quickly.
Under the agreement reached with the Stammers, Mengele supplied money to enable them to buy a larger farm. They moved to Serra Negra in 1962. From the outset, there was a difference in outlook between the Stammers and their guest. The Stammers were fun-loving, carefree Hungarians who saw the farm as a sideline. Mengele was a meticulous German who had hoped that his investment in the farm would eventually enable him to become financially independent of the family in Germany. Although Serra Negra was remote, Mengele was constantly worried that he might be discovered.
He was like this. Some days he didn't say a word and was very thoughtful. He would get on with his work and carry out all his duties, but he would keep very quiet. He began to go for long walks. He'd walk for hours and hours. Other days he would be more talkative, be quite happy and get on better with everybody. But suddenly he would start quarreling and complaining again.
Eichmann had been executed in Israel on the 31st of May, 1962. By now, Mengele was so anxious about his own safety that he built a watchtower at Serra Negra.
We had several sources which pointed out that he's in Brazil. And the breakthrough came after I personally succeeded to recruit the help of the former SS officer, who, it wasn't easy, but he eventually convinced himself that the so-called medical experiments that Mengele was accused of by the German government, by the way, not by Israel, by the German government, were of such nature that it's against the good name of the SS. And every good SS man should do his best to bring this man to trial and to justice. He helped us, and he helped us to find a German who lived in Sao Paulo. And when we followed this other man, we came to the area where I now am convinced that Mengele was living in 1962.
Wherever he went, the dogs were always with him. He had about 14 or 15 dogs, sometimes more, sometimes less. He didn't bring the dogs up here, but he used to come up here with me. He used to come up here with his binoculars to have a look round. I used to do the same.
Could you see the road from here?
No. Well, you could see a good way. The line of the road is quite clear from here.
It was quite difficult to shadow this place and to photograph it, but we tried to do our best. We used some native Brazilians. We dressed them up in simple clothes. I remember one guy walked without any shoes on for 5 miles just to show that he's a local guy. And as I said, at one occasion, whilst driving with a local man on the sand path leading to this group of houses, I met a man who I now believe to be Mengele, because I now saw his pictures in the German television, and it was the same man. Let me tell you this. While we were shadowing Eichmann, I once was on a bus with him, and I was touching shoulders with him, and it was quite exciting. But I was much more excited when I met whom I now believe to be Mengele on the sandy road. I was shaking. But, as I said before, I'm a soldier. I went to report, and my next mission had nothing to do with Mengele.
We could only try to capture him by force, with the use of arms. But because of the special conditions at the time, and the tension with Argentina caused by the Eichmann affair, and to prevent a scandal before the trial of Eichmann in Jerusalem, I decided that we could not do it this way.
החלטתי בדרך זאת אנחנו לא יכולים לעשות את זה, והתחלתי לחפש דרכים אחרות.
I started to look for other ways to capture him, more sophisticated ways to penetrate Mengele's circle and to reach him from the inside. But in March 1963, whilst all this was happening, I resigned, so all these plans were abandoned.
The world, however, still centered its attention on Paraguay. Places like Nazi sympathizer Alban Krug's farm were high on the list as likely Mengele hideouts. Numerous pictures were published purporting to be Mengele. These photographs, for instance, were taken in Asunción airport. Perhaps the most widely published picture of all was this man, filmed on a riverbank in Paraguay and shown all over the world, all of it fantasy. He was even reputed to have returned to Günzburg in 1959 for the funeral of his father, Karl, and it was said sheltered by the nuns here in the Englischer convent. But Mengele did not arrive. After a tip-off to the family by the Bavarian police, Mengele cancelled his trip. It was not long before Rolf Mengele discovered the true identity of his so-called Uncle Fritz.
I think it was after the capture of Eichmann, then the name of my father appeared in German newspapers first, or again. And at school, it seems to me it was 1960, in the 60s, so I was 16 years old. And I was asked by my school colleagues, "Is this your father?" And they teased me, and so I learned that it is my father. I would have had preferred another father, of course. I was very unhappy and it was a difficult time. And yes, it was not so easy.
One day somebody left a newspaper and there was an item of news about the Nazi executioners, as they called them. I saw this photograph there of a young man of about 30 or 33 years old, looking like this. Then I thought that this face was very familiar to me, with the smile and the gaps between the teeth. I showed him the photograph and said, "Look at this photograph. It looks very much like you. You're so mysterious. You live here with us. So please be honest and tell us whether it's you or not." Later he said, "Well, you're right. I live here with you, so you have the right to know that, unfortunately, that person is me."
Alarmed by the real identity of their farm manager, the Stammers told Gerhard they wanted Mengele to leave. Gerhard contacted Gunsberg, who dispatched Sedlmayr with more money.
It created problems because he was really incorporated in the family, and he felt as a family member. However, and I think the most important thing was Gitta Stammer flirted a little bit with him and made pressure to her husband by his connection to my father and her relation to him. And the second problem is they have two sons, and as my father did not have his son, so he took these two boys, and of course they always he tried to form them and to bring them forward and to explain them why they have to learn and to improve.
By 1969, the Stammers and their guest were on the move again.
One side, Mengele, is constructing a spider web in a very intelligent way, woven from threads of human relation and financial interests, while the other one, Mr. Stammer, tries eagerly to get free from it like a flea in the spider web.
At Calleras, only 25 miles outside Sao Paulo, Mengele was able to use his considerable skills as a carpenter to rebuild the house. But as his diaries show, the relationship between himself and the Stammers gradually grew worse. An ever more embittered and intellectually arrogant Mengele, who was becoming increasingly paranoid, attempted to dominate the whole family, even to the point of insisting that they should speak German rather than Hungarian at meals, for he feared they were plotting against him. By the early 70s, their differences had almost reached breaking point.
Vocês acham? Gerhard told me, do what you want, but be very careful. This matter is very involved and serious.
Como se chama? Sério, né? Qualquer coisa que vocês façam, primeiro.
So since he lives here with you, whatever you do, think first of the consequences for the future of your sons.
Precisa muito pensar para o futuro de seus filhos.
Because otherwise they might not have a future.
It was obvious to Gerhard that he could no longer continue to persuade the Stammers to keep Mengele, so he started to look around for a new host, and he found this man, Wolfram Bossert.
He knew that he was getting older and that he might have to live by himself one day. He wanted to be part of a family. But we knew when we had had time to observe life in the Stammer household that it wouldn't work if he came to live with us, that he would destroy our family, not on purpose, of course.
Wolfram Bossert admired Mengele as an honored member of the elite of the Third Reich. To Lieselotte, his wife, and their two children, he was Tio, uncle, the fascinating old man who spent hours with them patiently and skillfully building a boat. So when the inevitable split with the Stammers came in 1974, Sedlmayr arrived from Günzburg with more funds. The farm was sold. The Stammers purchased a villa in the north of Sao Paulo, and for Mengele a bungalow in El Dorado, on the shabbier side of the city. Mengele lived his last 5 years alone in El Dorado, with his black mongrel dog Borsche, and daily visits from Elsa, his maid, and weekly discussions with Wolfram Bossert.
In his profession as a doctor, he had incredibly high ethical standards. The house where he lived is situated on a bend, where the road drops sharply and there were frequent car accidents. He once said to me, if anybody were injured in a crash, I would of course have to go and help them. I told him, no, if there's a crash, you go to the bottom of your garden and hide in the shed, pretending to see or hear nothing. Because if you go and help them, they'll see straight away that you know about these things. Then the police will arrive and take photographs and ask you whether you're a doctor, and then you'll have no papers and you'll be exposed, and you'll be finished. And he replied, you don't understand. I am a doctor, and it's my duty to help an injured person, even if it costs me my life.
Certainly his existence here was sad, because, I mean, he developed that tic, a nervous tic, biting his moustache so much that all the hair he swallowed led to a closing of the intestines, and he had to be operated, you know. There you can see how he was eating up himself in this situation. So he certainly did not have a happy life here, always on the run. Bossert made big efforts to teach him how to move normally in public. For example, when he walked on the street and anybody crossed his path, he kept his hands in front of his face, always wearing a hat. Bossert, who was a humorous person, said with these habits he was among 13 million Paulistas, inhabitants of Sao Paulo, the only one using a hat and making like that all the time. So everybody was staring at him.
Mengele had always been worried that one day he would be discovered for lack of official identity papers. So when his close friend Wolfgang Gerhardt left for Austria in 1971, Mengele adapted Gerhardt's identity card, substituting his own photo. He was becoming increasingly isolated, and added to this, his health was beginning to fail.
He had a stroke, I heard, and then Sedelmeier told me, look, he's not good, and maybe he's old, and it would great pleasure to him meeting you once. And I said, yes, it seems to me much better than to write always these letters forwards, backwards. And then I decided really to meet him, and of course also to discuss also some questions. It was a strange feeling. I saw him there standing in the door. It was the evening. I was surprised. This is your father. He looked to me old, small, somehow a little bit broken. And it was a very difficult situation, because I knew that for him it was one of the most important events in his older days. And I was a visitor, and I was his son, and I really had to push me somehow to give a certain cordiality or certain expression of sentiments, and he was very, very touched by the situation. His eyes were wet and nearly to tears, and he was also very proud about the situation, because he felt that everybody from the family would not have had the power to come to him. And so he treated me somehow like a brave soldier which came through the enemy's lines. I avoided to speak about in the first days of our meeting. I avoided to speak about problematic points, as it is Auschwitz. Then later on, I came to this. Here, as I told you, he exploded, hearing this as a question from thy son to him. In the sense, how can you imagine that this is possible for me to do these things? Don't you see at the first line this is a lie or propaganda or I don't know why? When I then stepped backwards and said, okay, selection, I think this was a fact and was admitted by him very clearly. He excused himself by just saying, okay, I can't help hundreds of thousands if there is such a horrible organization and system. But he excused somehow to say, I helped many of them, few of them. I tried to make him clear that even to be in Auschwitz and not to try every day to come away from there is for me an horrible and impossible fact. I could never understand human being can act like this, and it would not change in any position if this is my father or not. It is really for me against all ethic and moral and human understanding and nature.
Rolf left Brazil, but his father stood firm by his National Socialist beliefs with not a word of regret.
All I know is that the subject came up once, after a newspaper had again claimed that he'd carried out inhuman experiments on patients or people in the camp. When I mentioned this, he exploded and shouted, "But I didn't make any experiments. It's all lies. The people volunteered because they got more food if they allowed me to take blood samples." He assured us time and time again that he deserved a statue from the Jews, because as a doctor at the camp, he'd saved many Jewish lives.
It was around 4:30 when we went down to the beach for a swim. Suddenly, my son noticed that the uncle, Mengele, was lying lopsided in the water, and I saw him too. I called to my husband that something was wrong with the uncle. His head was half out of the water, and it was clear that he was struggling desperately. His eyes were fixed and staring, and he looked determined to swim back. Of course, we now know that he had suffered a small stroke, and that he had tried to swim back despite this. My husband tried to get to the beach with him. But it was already too late.
According to the Bossets, Joseph Mengele drowned on the 7th of February, 1979, aged 67. Wolfram Bossert wrote to the family in Gunzburg, "With great sadness, I carry out the painful duty of informing you of the death of our mutual friend." For the next 6 years, the world escalated the search for Joseph Mengele until, in 1985, with $3.4 million on Mengele's head, the West German police raided Hans Sedlmayer's house in Gunzburg. They found Bosset's letter, which led the Brazilian police to the cemetery at Embu. The body was buried in this little cemetery just outside Sao Paulo on the 8th of February 1979, under the name of Wolfgang Gerhardt, in the Gerhardt family grave beside Wolfgang's mother. Mengele, the arch-racist, now lay alongside hundreds of Brazilians and peoples of other races whom he had so vehemently dismissed as racially impure. These are the remains of Joseph Mengele. During his time at Auschwitz, he carried out some of the most horrific experiments ever known. 400,000 people are said to have died at his hands. Many of the doctors who worked with him lived to continue their academic careers in peacetime Germany. So too did the professors who used his research. Professor Verschuer became professor of genetics at Munster University. He died a renowned scientist and a free man.
I think there's certainly a lesson to be learned, but of course the question is whether it will be learned. Mengele was a colleague. He was a colleague of ours. And he simply completely forgot that scientific without justice and with equal rights certainly ends up in a hell like Auschwitz. But I would say many colleagues are not willing to see that.
At that time, and still today, universities, of course, not only in the West, but also in the West, are educating what my colleague Franklin H. Littell of Temple University, Philadelphia, who is a Methodist minister and a minister of religion, a professor of religion, called technically competent barbarians. And we seem to be educating that to this day. In other words, our university education, I'm speaking as a university professor, is not geared to the kind of society that we are educating towards. And it does not prepare us to oppose the kind of developments that might end up or lead to a Holocaust. And I think this is a tremendous challenge that Mengele poses for us, because Mengele is a product of the kind of system that we still have, of universities all over the world that teach techniques, that teach quote-unquote science, but not the implications of it and not the use to which such things are put.
On June the 21st, 1985, after 2 weeks of meticulous examination of the body exhumed at Embu, 17 of the world's most eminent forensic scientists, each an expert in his own field, agreed that within a reasonable scientific certainty, this is the skeleton of Joseph Mengele. Although certain governments and many of his victims would wish Mengele to be alive, the evidence to date proves overwhelmingly that he is dead.